Good evening, class. We left off with our last class having looked at the first 500 years of church history. Numerous churches had been erected throughout the holy sites by Saint Helena. Another development in the first 500 years was that of monasticism. This continued after those first 500 years and continues into the present day. Monasticism is the devotion of one's life to prayer, work, study, and the needs of the community. While early monastics lived as hermits, Basil the Great developed a system of rules called the rules of life. It was by these rules of life the monk would vow to live, and generally included vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These were called the evangelical counsels. Monks also followed a daily routine revolving around community prayer, manual labor, contemplation, and service to those in need. Around 529 AD, Benedict of Nursia founded a monastery for monks at Monte Cassino, Italy. His sister, Scholastica, founded a similar monastery for nuns. Benedict's motto became Ora et Labora, pray and work. Locally, in the New Orleans area, we have St. Joseph's Abbey, which is a monastery. The monks of St. Joseph's Abbey produce a number of goods including soap, honey, works of art, burial caskets, and bread. The Abbey produces 2,000 loaves of bread each week and are distributed throughout the New Orleans metropolitan area. The Abbey also operates a seminary college to assist in the formation of those interested in the priesthood. While monks remained in the monastery, friars took the opposite approach. The word friar comes from the word frater, meaning brother. While monks were apart from the world, friars did their work in full view of the world. They would also depend completely on the generosity of others for their daily needs. Typically, they worked directly with the poor and would travel from town to town, preaching the gospel. Friars lived out Christ's words, to sell all that you have and distribute it to the poor. The two most well-known orders are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Getting back to our history, Pope Saint Gregory the Great became Pope in the late 6th century. He evangelized pagan tribes and worked to promote their conversion. Gregory also contributed to canon law, the rules used to govern the church, or ecclesial governance. The a cappella music you sometimes hear at Mass, sung as a chant, bears Gregory's name and is called Gregorian chant. The next leader we'll take a look at was Charlemagne. Through the centuries, the Franks had gradually conquered all of what had been the western part of the Roman Empire. In Rome, on Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne the leader of the Franks as the Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne worked to reorganize the hierarchy of the church. He also furthered education, decreeing that all monasteries open their classrooms to ordinary people, not just those studying to become monks and nuns. He also encouraged monastic libraries to preserve and to copy ancient manuscripts. By the year 1000 AD, most of what had previously been considered barbarian Europe had now been converted to Christianity. Now in the East, not all was well. Throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, Muslim armies invaded the Holy Land, North Africa, and Spain, where it would remain under Muslim rule for about 800 years. At the same time, a schism formed between the Eastern and Western churches, led by Rome and Constantinople. The Western Church is what we know today as the Roman Catholic Church, while the Eastern Church is composed of 22 Eastern churches in union with Rome. Those not in union with Rome are known as the Eastern Orthodox churches. At Mary Queen of Peace, we have a priest who is part of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Monsignor William Belinsky. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is one of the 22 Eastern churches in union with Rome. Now, we have to move on to the topic of the Crusades. As a result of the Muslims taking the Holy Land, Crusades were organized to retake this land. So you might ask, what was a crusade? Traditionally, there were 8 recognized crusades against the Muslims in the Holy Land or in Egypt or in Spain. The word crusade would not have been used in the Middle Ages. They were called cruces signate, or those signed by the cross. Passagia was the journey they were undertaking, or the passage, or the pilgrimage. They were undertaking a passage to the Holy Land. There were several characteristics which would define a crusade. First, the Crusaders had to take a cross. They were, after all, signed with a mark of the cross. It was a public vow to take the cross, and it was typical for a cloth cross to be sewn onto your clothing. The armed expedition had to be endorsed by or approved by the Pope. The Church promised protection of the Crusaders' family and property while on the crusade by threat of excommunication for any person who attacked a Crusader's family or tried to take his property while he was away at a crusade. You were immune from arrest and from paying tolls while on a crusade. You could also demand and receive hospitality from churches or monasteries in countries where you were traveling to or through. Lastly, you would be granted indulgences for engaging in a crusade. This was the remission of temporal punishment for sins already forgiven in confession. Popes encouraged crusading, beginning with Blessed Pope Urban II in 1095. 6 out of our 21 ecumenical councils have discussed, legislated on, or made plans for crusades. That is almost 1/3 of the total ecumenical councils. So what was the catalyst that began these crusades? Muhammad united all Arabs under Allah. Muhammad taught the Ummah, which was a community of Muslim believers. Muhammad taught that people were either in the house of Islam, which was a Muslim believer, or in the house of war, a non-believer of Islam. It was the job and the vocation of those in the house of Islam to bring those who were in the house of war into the house of Islam, even if by force or by armed struggle, today's jihad. Now, today's understanding of jihad is presented as an interior spiritual Muslim struggle, but this understanding came much later. Muhammad dies in 632 AD. His last direction was, "Fight all men until there is no God but Allah." After his death, there's a Muslim conquest from 632 AD until the 8th century. Christian lands are overrun by Muslims in North Africa in 700 AD. In Spain, Portugal, and Israel, Jerusalem falls in 638 AD. Syria in 635 AD. The great city of Antioch in 637 AD. And Egypt in 642 AD. The Muslim Seljuk Turks attacked the Byzantine Roman Empire in 1071 AD. The Byzantine Empire is captured in the Battle of Manzikert, located in Anatolia. This was a stronghold for food production and military recruitment. A few years afterwards, the emperor then writes a letter to Pope St. Gregory II asking for his help. His successor, Blessed Urban II, travels to Clermont, France, and he calls for the First Crusade. Pope Urban II knew that this would be a tough sell since the Eastern and Western Christians had just split in the Great Schism of 1054, whereby the Eastern churches ceased to recognize the authority of the Pope less than 20 years prior. So, rather than focusing on liberating Constantinople and the Byzantines, Pope Urban II focused the crusade on the liberation of Jerusalem from the Muslims. The crusade leaves on August 15th, 1096, the Feast of the Assumption. This was considered a just war, a defensive war to recover lands taken by the Muslims. In the First Crusade, nearly 80% of those involved die. The cost to a crusader was roughly 4 times his annual income. He often sold land to finance his crusade. The vast majority of those who survived to return home were often impoverished. A crusader was almost never there to grab land or to become rich. There are several myths surrounding the idea of crusading which emerged through the years. The first myth was that Crusades were a war of aggression against the Muslims. In the 11th century, the ruler of Egypt and the Holy Land was a man named Al-Hakim. He ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built by St. Helena over the place where Christ had been crucified and buried. The Muslims gave the name of this site the Church of the Dung Heap. Al-Hakim forced Jews to wear a large block of wood around their necks, and Christians were forced by the Muslims to wear large heavy crosses around their necks. Many others were forced to convert to Islam. Any exterior crosses on churches were removed during his reign, and the missals that people used to follow the readings at Mass were destroyed. Bishop Gunther of Bamberg led a pilgrimage of 12,000 people towards Jerusalem while they were in Caesarea on Good Friday, only 2 days out from Jerusalem. They were attacked, and nearly all 12,000 were killed, with only a few pilgrims escaping and a few others being sold into slavery. These persecutions all contributed to the crusade, illustrating further that the Crusades were a defensive war to regain land taken from the Christians and in response to Christian persecution, not a war of aggression against the Muslims. There was a second myth. The Crusades were the result of a huge population boom in Europe. Now, it's true that there was an increase in population in Europe. The argument went that when, you had 3, 4, or even 5 sons, there would be no land inheritance for the later born children. Therefore, crusades were implemented as land grabs for those children who would not inherit land from the family. In-depth studies showed, though, that firstborns were most likely to undertake the crusade and often sold their land to finance the trip. Most people went for indulgences that they received on the trip. There's a story of 2 brothers, Geoffrey and Guy, who sold their land to a monastery to finance the trip. The bill of sale actually read, "They went for the grace of the pilgrimage and under the protection of God to exterminate wickedness and the unrestrained rage of the pagans by which innumerable Christians have already been oppressed, made captive, and killed." Otto of Burgundy attended a minor crusade in 1101, and he wrote, "I undertook the journey of Jerusalem as a penance for my sins, since divine mercy inspired me that owing to the enormity of my sins I should go to the sepulchre of our Savior." Yet another, named De Beer of Nogent, wrote, "The Crusader set himself to the task of winning back the earthly Jerusalem in order to enjoy the celestial Jerusalem." And so you see, the vast majority of those who survived went home after liberating Jerusalem. Of the many thousands who entered into Jerusalem during the crusade, only 2,000 remained in Jerusalem after its liberation. This puts to rest the myth that crusades were only for the purpose of a land grab. The third and final myth that we'll discuss is that the Crusades are a source of modern-day tension between the West and Islam. Now, modern-day scholars try to illustrate this in some of their speeches, but the reality is that the Crusades were forgotten in Islam until about the mid-19th century. The first history of the Crusades was not even written in Arabic until 1899. Even today, though, there are those who would perpetuate the myth of a modern-day tension with Islam resulting from the Crusades. In November 2001, former President Bill Clinton said in a speech at Georgetown University, "The reason we were attacked on 9/11 was due to the Crusades." It was not until the 20th century and the colonial efforts made in the Islamic world that comparisons were even made to the Crusades as the original colonization of the Muslim world. And then, the Arab children began to be taught that the Crusades were a good versus evil situation, where zealous crusaders swept into a peaceful Muslim world, leaving carnage and destruction in their wake. Pope John Paul II was shot in 1981, but he survived. His would-be assassin was a man named Mehmet Ali Agha, who wrote, I have decided to kill Pope John Paul II, the supreme commander of the Crusades. Osama bin Laden wrote in October of 2001, "This is a battle of Muslims against the global crusaders. Our goal is for the nation to unite in the face of the Christian crusade. This is a recurring war. The original crusades were brought about by Richard of England, Louis of France, and Barbarossa from Germany. Today, the crusading countries rushed as soon as Bush raised the cross. They accepted the rule of the cross." History, though, demonstrates otherwise, illustrating the Muslim world largely forgot about the Crusades until the 19th century. Another major occurrence in the Church during the Middle Ages was the institution of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was begun to bring heretics back into the teachings of the Church. In the worst-case scenario, a heretic who refused to confess his heresy was remanded to the state for execution. Primarily, though, the purpose was to convert the heretic, thus saving his soul. The Inquisition begins in the latter part of the 12th century. In 1184, Pope Lucius sends a list of heresies to the bishops of the world, telling the bishops they must play an active role in determining the guilt or innocence of a heretic. He writes this because secular rulers had already begun judging heretics, but they had no formal theological training, and they did not know if a stated belief was heresy or not. In 1231 AD, Gregory IX formally institutes papal inquisitors. Now, a papal inquisitor had to be at least 40 years of age, have some formal theological training, and have led a moral life. It is important to note that during this time period, heresy was not only a church crime, but a secular crime as well, and a capital crime at that, punishable only through secular authority. While the church was primarily concerned with saving the soul of a heretic, the secular authority was primarily concerned with punishing the heretic. One must first ask, though, what is a heretic? A heretic was someone who was baptized, but was now denying the truth taught by the church. One may also ask, how does this Inquisition work? The papal inquisitors would come to a town, they would preach the authentic faith, and they would open up a period of grace. During this period, you could come to the inquisitor and confess that you had believed a heresy, and the inquisitor would issue a penance. After the voluntary period closed, there would then be a period whereby others could report you as a heretic. Evidence would be gathered and you would also be questioned. There were detailed records kept by the inquisitors. Throughout the process, the accused could repent of believing a heresy. He could also call his own witnesses to substantiate his belief in the authentic faith. A common misconception of the Inquisition is the use of torture. This was only allowed after 1252 AD. It was more common in the secular world than in the Inquisition, and the inquisitors never performed torture, rather turned the accused over to the secular rulers to carry out any torture. It was only used to elicit a confession, not as a punishment for having believed a heresy. For those who confessed, a penance was provided. Penances sometimes involved fasting or wearing a colored garment, participating in a crusade, or providing alms to help build a church. If an accused refused to confess, despite evidence that the accused believed heretical teachings, the accused would then be handed over to the state or secular rulers. Remember, heresy was a crime of the state as well as a crime of the church. The church under canon law could not execute a heretic, but the state could. The church then would sometimes remand a heretic to the state, who would then execute the heretic. In total, there were roughly 5,000 heretics executed between 1227 and 1277 AD. One papal inquisitor named Bernard Guy in the south of France passed 930 judgments against heretics. Only 42 of those judgments were remanded to the state. The vast majority were brought back into the church through confession of the heresy. The last major development in the Church during this time period involved Pope Innocent III. In 1225, he called an ecumenical council, the Fourth Lateran Council. Among other topics discussed was the edict that Catholics must receive Holy Communion at least once per year. On the same topic, the term transubstantiation was decided upon to describe the reality of bread and wine changing into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. This time period was one of great tumult, from the loss of the Holy Land to the Crusades and the Inquisition. However, the Church was about to face an even greater challenge as disease swept across Europe, followed by an even greater sweeping across Europe in the Reformation. We will delve deeper into these topics in the coming weeks. Until then, class, have a great week. Thank you for your time tonight.